Hi, and welcome back to Historic Book. What if I told you that in 1939, a 5-year-old child walked into a hospital in Peru, not because she was sick, but because she was 7 months pregnant? What if I told you that doctors thought it was a hoax, a mistake, or a cruel prank, until the truth was undeniable? This isn't folklore. It's one of the most disturbing verified medical cases in human history. A story that left scientists speechless, journalists horrified, and the world unable to look away. Her name was Lina Medina, and by the time she turned 6, she had already given birth to a healthy baby boy. The headlines that followed were sensational, but behind them lay a truth far darker, a truth no one wanted to confront. Because Lina was not a miracle. She was a victim of something no 5-year-old should ever endure. And yet, to this day, the identity of the father, the nature of the crime, and the silence that followed remain buried beneath layers of denial and secrecy. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Historic Book for more stories from the forgotten corners of history, where horror and truth often share the same heartbeat. Because today, we are not exploring myth or superstition. We're uncovering a case that science could explain, but morality could never justify. The story began in a tiny Andean village called Tacrapo, nestled high in the mountains of Peru. The Medina family lived a simple life. Her father, Tiburcio, was a craftsman. Her mother, Victoria, cared for their 9 children. Life was hard but quiet, untouched by the chaos of the world beyond their valley. Until one day in the spring of 1939, Victoria noticed something strange about her youngest daughter. Lina's belly was swelling. At first, her parents thought it might be a tumor, a tragic but not uncommon illness in such isolated places. They took her to local healers, who prescribed herbs and prayers. But the swelling didn't stop. Eventually, when her abdomen grew so large that she could barely walk, the Medinas traveled by mule to the city of Pisco, where doctors examined her. What they found left them stunned. The child was not sick. She was 7 months pregnant. At first, the doctors refused to believe it. They performed tests, thinking the results must be wrong. But Lina's body showed signs of full physical maturity. Her hips had widened, her breasts had developed, and her uterus measured consistent with a near-term pregnancy. It was impossible, yet undeniable. The diagnosis was confirmed by Lima's Dr. Gerardo Lozada, one of Peru's most respected physicians. He transferred her to a hospital in the capital for further observation. There, Lina Medina became a living paradox. A child carrying another child, a mystery that science could document but never fully understand. By the time Lina arrived at the maternity hospital of Lima, the story had already begun to spread through Peru like wildfire. Doctors, journalists, and government officials crowded the halls, each refusing to believe what the others claimed to have seen. A 5-year-old girl pregnant? It was obscene, impossible, and yet, as the medical examinations continued, it became horrifyingly clear. The child was telling the truth without speaking a word. Lina was quiet, withdrawn, her eyes dark and distant. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She simply stared as if she understood something that no one else in the room did. Dr. Lozada and his team performed X-rays, blood tests, and a pelvic examination. Every result confirmed it. She was indeed pregnant, and the fetus was alive. Her case defied biology. Medical records would later reveal that Lina had begun menstruating at just 8 months old, and her body reached full reproductive maturity by the age of 3, a rare condition known as precocious puberty, so rare that fewer than 100 cases have ever been recorded in history. The doctors faced a dilemma that went far beyond science. They were no longer treating a patient. They were protecting a child who had already been irreparably harmed. But from whom? From what? The investigation began. Police interrogated Lina's parents, neighbors, even distant relatives. Her father, Tiburcio Medina, was arrested on suspicion of sexual assault. He denied everything, and after a short time, was released due to lack of evidence. The truth, whatever it was, dissolved into silence. Meanwhile, Lina remained under the constant care of Dr. Lozada, who tried to keep the press away as he prepared for the unthinkable, the delivery of a baby from a 5-year-old mother. On May 14, 1939, inside a quiet hospital room filled with anxious physicians, Lina Medina was wheeled into surgery. The small child clutched a doll in her hand as she was given anesthesia. Moments later, through a carefully performed cesarean section, she delivered a baby boy weighing 2.7 kilograms, healthy, crying, and utterly normal. The doctors named him Gerardo, after Dr. Lazada himself. To the outside world, it was a medical miracle. To those in the room, it was something closer to tragedy. When Lina awoke, she didn't seem to understand what had happened. She stared blankly at the newborn beside her bed, and when asked who the child was, she said softly, "He's my brother." The hospital, unable to process what had occurred, turned the case into a national secret. Photographs were restricted. Medical documents were sealed. And yet, the news broke internationally within weeks. Headlines screamed across the world. World's youngest mother, age 5. Reporters from the US, Europe, and Latin America tried to visit her village. Journalists offered money for interviews. Film companies offered to buy her story, but the Peruvian government refused. Lina was sent home, her identity carefully hidden, her life reduced to rumor and disbelief. The baby, Gerardo, grew up believing Lina was his sister. The family guarded the secret as though it were a curse, a truth too painful, too humiliating to name. And as the years passed, that silence became the heaviest part of Lina Medina's story. In the years following her child's birth, Lina Medina vanished from public life. Her small village in Tacrapo, Peru, became a place of guarded whispers and wary eyes. Neighbors no longer spoke her name aloud. To them, she was a mystery best forgotten, a child who bore another child, a living contradiction that defied nature and faith alike. Her family refused all interviews. Her mother aged rapidly, worn down by shame and confusion, while her father kept a stoic silence that only deepened suspicion. Though officially cleared of any crime, few in the village ever looked him in the eye again. Some said he was guilty. Others claimed the truth was darker still, that Lina's condition was proof of something unnatural, something spiritual or cursed. The church intervened briefly, demanding to know how such a thing could happen under God's watch. When no answer came, the priests stopped asking. They, too, turned away. Meanwhile, Gerardo grew up healthy, bright, and curious. He called Lina his sister for nearly a decade, never questioning the deep sadness that lingered in her eyes. The family's poverty worsened. Offers from foreign newspapers promised wealth and comfort, but the Medinas refused every deal. Lina never sought fame or sympathy. She simply wanted to be left alone, a request few honored. Photographers would travel for days to capture even a distant image of her. American doctors tried to re-examine her case in the 1950s, but Lina declined every interview. By her teenage years, the scars of her childhood had hardened into quiet resilience. She rarely smiled, rarely spoke, and worked in a local factory to support her family. Her only joy was Gerardo, the child she had never been allowed to claim. The two shared an unspoken bond, not of siblings, nor mother and son, but something beyond either word, something forged in tragedy. As time went on, Lina's story became a footnote in medical journals, a strange, tragic case often cited but rarely understood. Her photograph appeared in textbooks, always without context, her name a symbol of medical impossibility. Yet behind every mention of her record was the same unanswered question: who had done this to her? Investigators revisited the case multiple times in the following decades. Some proposed that Lina's condition might have been exploited by someone close to her. Others claimed she had suffered a biological anomaly, her body capable of conception but lacking the comprehension of what it meant. No one ever confessed. No proof ever surfaced. The truth remained locked away, buried under layers of shame and fear. Gerardo grew into adulthood unaware of his true parentage until his teenage years, when the truth was finally revealed. According to reports, he took the news with calm disbelief, later describing Lina as a woman stronger than anyone I've ever known. He died young, in his 40s from bone marrow disease, a tragedy that left Lena alone once more. After his death, she withdrew entirely from the public eye. In her later years, Lena married quietly, had another child, and settled into anonymity. She never spoke of her past again, not even to her husband. When journalists tracked her down in the 1970s, she refused to give interviews, saying only, "There are things that shouldn't be remembered." Her silence became her final act of defiance, a refusal to let the world that had violated her curiosity violate her peace. Even today, no one truly knows who fathered her child, nor how a 5-year-old could carry a baby to term. All that remains are medical files, a handful of photographs, and a legend that still unsettles science and humanity alike. As decades passed, Lena Medina's story faded into the margins of history, yet it never truly disappeared. In medical schools, her case was discussed in hushed tones, a biological impossibility, often presented alongside X-rays and reports that stripped her identity into mere data. Professors spoke of her uterus, her hormones, her physical maturity, but rarely of her fear, her confusion, or her stolen childhood. In Peru, her name became a ghost story. Mothers warned their daughters not to wander at night. Fathers whispered that Lena had been punished by the heavens. The scientific community called it a miracle of medicine. The church called it a test of faith. The villagers called it a curse. And Lena, caught between all three, became something no one could define. Neither victim nor anomaly, simply the child the world refused to understand. By the 1990s, the few surviving doctors from the original case admitted that parts of her file had gone missing, pages torn, photographs lost, and test results that could have explained everything mysteriously vanished. Some believed they were stolen by journalists. Others suspected something darker, that the truth had been erased to protect reputations, or perhaps to bury an unspeakable crime. In Lima's archives, one doctor's note still survives. Patient appears healthy. Emotional state, withdrawn. Speaks rarely. Refuses to discuss father of child. Those few words have fueled decades of speculation, but no certainty. Lena's silence was not weakness. It was armor. In a world obsessed with her tragedy, she chose not to perform her pain. Instead, she lived quietly, an act of rebellion in itself. She grew old, raised her family, and guarded her story like a secret that could still wound the living. Today, Lena Medina's case remains one of the most disturbing and debated medical mysteries in recorded history. Her story forces humanity to confront the boundaries between science and morality, between what can be explained and what should never have happened. Every few years, a journalist or filmmaker attempts to rediscover her, to turn her suffering into a headline once more. They call her the youngest mother in history, reducing a lifetime of endurance into a grotesque record. But beneath that label lies something deeper, a reminder of how easily society consumes tragedy when it belongs to the poor, the voiceless, the forgotten. Her image, frozen in black and white, has become a symbol of lost innocence. Yet, if you look closely at that photograph, the small girl with hollow eyes and a solemn face, you don't see shock. You see exhaustion. You see a child who had already understood too much about cruelty. Lena Medina never sought justice, and perhaps she knew there was none to be found. Her story is not only about biology, but about abandonment, about how a child's suffering became the world's curiosity. When she died, she took her truth with her. There were no memoirs, no final confessions, only silence. But maybe that was her answer all along. Maybe she knew that no explanation could undo what had been done, that sometimes silence is the only power left to those the world refuses to hear. And so, Lena Medina remains an eternal question, not of science, but of conscience. A child who bore a child. A mystery that medicine solved, but humanity never did. In the end, Lena Medina's life became more myth than memory. Her existence, once doubted, later dissected, stands as one of the most unsettling crossroads between innocence and atrocity. She didn't choose to be a symbol, yet history made her one. the embodiment of how deeply the world can misunderstand a child's suffering. For decades, researchers tried to interpret her story through data and medical terms. They examined her hormone levels, her pelvic development, her early puberty, trying to find reason in something that reason itself refused to touch. But science could never measure the weight of what she carried. Not only a child within her womb, but a secret that belonged to no language. The world wanted answers, not empathy. They wanted to study her, not save her. They documented her body, but ignored her voice. Even her photograph, taken when she was barely 6, was circulated in papers without permission, stripped of her humanity, and turned into spectacle. And yet, Lena endured. She lived to old age, quietly, far from the whispers that haunted her name. She married, she worked, and she mothered once more, this time by choice. But the echoes of her childhood tragedy followed her through every decade, even when no one spoke of it. It lingered in every medical file, every classroom discussion, every moral debate about where human decency ends. Her silence became a warning, an unspoken reminder that behind every record-breaking story lies someone's broken life. That not all miracles are blessings. That sometimes the most horrifying part of history isn't what happened, but how easily we looked away. To this day, Lena Medina's name appears in textbooks, museum archives, and documentaries across the world. But behind the clinical tone, the true horror remains buried. How a 5-year-old child became a mother, and no one was ever held accountable. How a village's silence protected its shame. How the world watched, fascinated, but did nothing. We call it the youngest case of motherhood in history, but perhaps it should be called something else entirely. The clearest proof of how cruel history can be when it chooses curiosity over compassion. In every generation, there are stories like Lena's, stories that expose the frailty of our morals, the failure of our systems, and the way we consume tragedy when it's far enough from our own homes. Lena's story endures not because it's unique, but because it still happens, in different forms, under different names, to different children who never make the headlines. As her grave in Peru remains unmarked and unvisited, her legacy lingers as a question that still divides the world. Was Lena Medina a medical marvel, or the ultimate proof of society's neglect? The truth may never surface, but her existence demands we remember her, not as a mystery, but as a mirror. Because sometimes, the darkest corners of history don't belong to monsters or myths. They belong to the moments when humanity forgot what it meant to protect its own. So when you hear her name again, don't think of the record. Think of the silence. And remember that somewhere in that silence, a 5-year-old child once became the world's youngest mother and the world's oldest question. After Lena Medina's story broke, the world wasn't merely shocked. It was fascinated in the most unsettling way. Newspapers from New York to Paris competed to buy her story. Headlines screamed words like "miracle mother" and "Peruvian virgin birth," as if the suffering of a 5-year-old were a spectacle to sell. Medical journals printed diagrams of her anatomy, reducing her to a medical curiosity rather than a person. In Europe, scientists argued whether her condition was divine punishment or nature's rare malfunction. The Catholic Church quietly condemned the reports, unable to reconcile the event with theology. Yet the press, hungry for sensation, continued to exploit the case. Offers of money, sponsorships, and scientific custody arrived at her doorstep. Some suggested taking Lena abroad for study. Others proposed adopting her child as a national case study in fertility. Her family refused everything, perhaps out of love, or perhaps because they feared further humiliation. Either way, the refusal only fueled global obsession. Within months, the Medinas became prisoners in their own village, their home surrounded by reporters and strangers carrying cameras. One account described a photographer sneaking through their window to capture an image of Lena and her baby. The photograph was published without consent and would haunt her for the rest of her life. To the world, she was no longer a girl. She was a phenomenon, something to dissect and debate, a body without a story. And so, While others made headlines and profits, Lena was left behind, quiet, hidden, growing up in the same town that once shamed her. The world moved on, but not her. Not the memory. Not the questions that refused to die. By the mid-20th century, the name Lena Medina had faded from popular memory, but her case lingered in scientific literature, unsettling proof that something so grotesque could occur. To the medical world, she became a case study, but to psychologists, she became something darker, a warning of how trauma can shape a life even when words fail. Modern researchers revisiting the case in the 1970s noted the eerie consistency in Lena's silence. She never contradicted herself, never embellished, never confessed to anything. She simply did not speak of what had happened. For a woman who had once been the center of the world's gaze, her quietness was deafening. Her survival, however, spoke louder than any interview ever could. She didn't crumble under the weight of what had been taken from her. Instead, she lived on as if daring the world to forget. And forget, eventually, it did. Today, her story resurfaces occasionally, on internet forums, in documentaries, whispered across social media, each time met with the same disbelief. How could this be real? But it was. The hospital records still exist, the birth certificate was real, and the X-rays, though grainy, confirmed what many refused to believe. And yet, the tragedy of Lena Medina is not that she became a mother. It's that she became a story no one wanted to own. Governments dismissed it as folklore. Doctors called it anomaly. The church called it sin. And the world called it the youngest mother, as if a title could mask the horror. Lena's truth was never hidden. It was simply too unbearable to face. For those who surrounded Lena Medina during her brief, unwanted moment in history, silence became a lifelong companion. Dr. Gerardo Lozada, the man who had first examined her, never fully recovered from what he witnessed. In interviews years later, he described the experience as the day medicine stopped making sense. He had seen disease, deformity, and death, but nothing prepared him for the sight of a child carrying another child. He had written in his notes that Lena's body showed signs of precocious development, a phrase clinical enough to explain the impossible, but empty enough to hide the horror. That phrase would later appear in countless medical papers, as though reducing her suffering to a condition could erase its cruelty. Lozada received international praise for his documentation, yet those close to him claimed he was never the same. He stopped taking child patients. He grew withdrawn, reclusive, and spoke little of the case except in private, where he often described his guilt for not protecting her. "We were too focused on the science," he wrote once, "and not enough on the child." Others weren't as tormented. Some doctors treated Lena as a subject to be measured and examined, ordering tests, photographing her body, and debating her future as if she weren't listening. For Lena, these visits were as frightening as the pregnancy itself. Each new test brought strangers into her room, strangers who stared, whispered, and wrote about her as though she were already gone. When the birth was over, those same men left Tecrapo with medals, recognition, and their names in textbooks. Lena was left behind with scars, whispers, and a future that no one had planned for. Her tragedy had made careers. Her silence had made headlines. And her suffering had been filed away as scientific discovery. The villagers of Tecrapo carried the weight of that story like a curse. For years, outsiders traveled to see the girl mother, offering money for a glimpse, sometimes sneaking through windows, sometimes bribing neighbors for information. The people of the town began to fear her. Some said her presence brought misfortune, others that she was touched by spirits. Children weren't allowed near her house. Mothers crossed themselves when they passed by. But behind those walls, Lena's life was painfully ordinary. She cleaned, she cooked, she took care of her child, Gerardo. The world wanted horror, but what she lived was monotony, poverty, labor, and loneliness. The man who had fathered her child was never identified, and perhaps that was the cruelest part. Without a name, there could be no justice. Without a confession, there could be no closure. The investigation, if it could be called one, was thin at best. Her father was arrested briefly, questioned, and released. Theories spread, some outlandish, some disturbingly plausible, but none supported by evidence. As the media frenzy grew, the authorities simply stopped looking. In time, Lena's suffering was rewritten as a curiosity, an unexplained event. By the time she turned 10, the world had moved on to newer tragedies. Newspapers that once demanded answers now called her case an unfortunate phenomenon. Her name, once splashed across international headlines, disappeared into medical archives. But trauma does not fade just because the world forgets. It lingers in her quiet gaze, in the way she avoided mirrors, in the way she would later tell her own child never to trust strangers. Lena Medina became a living memory of how swiftly empathy can vanish when curiosity takes its place. Lena's tragedy was not confined to the dusty roads of Tecrapo. Her story became a mirror for the entire world, a reflection of how deeply society could fail its most vulnerable. Across oceans, her case stirred debates in medical schools and religious halls, yet few spoke of what truly mattered. The question wasn't how Lena became a mother. It was why no one protected her. In 1939, Peru was a nation struggling under economic hardship and superstition. The idea of female innocence was both sacred and fragile, and any stain upon it, especially one so scandalous, was treated as shame, not tragedy. The Medinas, poor and powerless, were left defenseless against a system that punished their silence but ignored their pain. Lena's body became proof of something larger than herself, the clash between progress and morality, between the hunger of science and the absence of empathy. For every doctor who marveled at her precocious puberty, there were countless others who failed to ask who had hurt her. The pursuit of knowledge blinded them to the human behind the case. Internationally, her story sparked fascination mixed with fear. In Europe, tabloids twisted her story into a modern myth, the child of miracles, the Virgin Mother of the Andes. They compared her to the Virgin Mary, a grotesque parallel that disguised horror as holiness. Some called it a medical wonder. Others whispered of witchcraft, divine punishment, or forbidden rituals. But for Lena, there was nothing divine about her suffering. There were no miracles, no prophecies, only a stolen childhood turned into a global headline. The world had given her a name and a title, but not a choice. And that was the truest horror of all. As the decades passed, historians began to reinterpret Lena's case, not as a marvel of biology, but as a testimony of collective failure. She was no longer a medical anomaly, but a symbol of exploitation, a reminder that the thirst for knowledge often consumes compassion along the way. In psychological studies, her silence became a point of fascination. Experts speculated that she might have suffered from selective mutism, a trauma response often found in children who've witnessed unbearable violence. Others suggested that her silence was strength, that refusing to speak was the only form of control she had left. Modern feminists in Latin America began reclaiming Lena's story in the 1990s, framing her not as a victim, but as evidence of systemic abuse, of patriarchal power, of poverty, of indifference. Documentaries and short films began to appear, though always tiptoeing around the same unanswerable question: who was responsible? No one ever knew. No confession, no closure. Only a child whose pain was turned into a myth so that the world could look away. And yet, Lena's existence forced humanity to confront itself. She stood as proof that atrocity can hide behind innocence, that even the smallest lives can carry the heaviest truths. In the stillness of her later years, when asked once more to speak, she simply said, "There's nothing to tell." But that wasn't true. There was everything to tell. Only the world had never learned to listen. As time passed, Lena Medina's story began to disappear, not naturally, but by design. Governments, doctors, and journalists who once paraded her as a medical marvel suddenly grew silent. Hospital archives in Lima lost records. Witnesses vanished. And the official story, once public, became a carefully curated myth. Some claimed her case was sealed for privacy. Others whispered that higher authorities had intervened, fearing what deeper investigation might reveal. After all, If the truth of Lena's pregnancy pointed to someone within her small village, or worse, within the institutions that claimed to protect her, then Peru's fragile moral order would crumble overnight. Dr. Gerardo Lozada, the physician who first treated Lena, gave few interviews after the initial frenzy. He described her pregnancy as a unique medical occurrence, but refused to discuss the details of conception. Over the years, his statements became increasingly guarded, almost rehearsed, as if memorized from an official script. Some researchers later suggested that Lozada may have shielded Lena from the authorities, believing she'd already suffered enough. Others accused him of complicity, of using her tragedy to advance his own career. Whatever the truth, his silence became as enigmatic as Lena's. The Peruvian government treated the case like a stain on its history, something better forgotten than understood. In an era when reputation was survival, no one wanted to admit that a child could be victimized under their watch. Newspapers that once printed her name now printed retractions. Her photos were locked away, her family relocated, and her life rewritten as a miracle. But beneath this orchestrated forgetting, the truth festered. Scientists from abroad who requested access to Lena's records found their inquiries denied or redirected. No data available, they were told. Case closed. Only a few persistent voices refused to let her vanish. They argued that Lena's silence wasn't consent, it was evidence. And evidence, buried long enough, always finds its way back to light. By the 1950s, rumors began to spread among journalists that certain hospital staff had been paid to keep quiet. A midwife, interviewed years later, claimed that not all tests and photographs were for medical study. Some were for private collections of European doctors fascinated by rare female anatomy. The statement was dismissed as hearsay, but it exposed a darker pattern. Lena's suffering had been commodified, turned into spectacle. Medical journals continued to cite her case, but stripped of context. They described the youngest recorded mother, without mentioning her trauma, her isolation, or the uninvestigated crime that made it possible. In turning her into data, they erased her humanity. There are still whispers that Lena's biological son, Gerardo, may not have died in 1979 as official records claim, that he may have changed his name and fled the country to escape the shadow of his birth. No one knows for sure. His grave remains unverified, his existence swallowed by speculation. In truth, every part of Lena's story was consumed by science, by religion, by fear. And yet, what survived is not the sensationalism, but the silence. That silence is her legacy, a quiet rebellion against the world that refused to see her as a person. Decades later, when a young reporter from Lima tracked Lena down in the 1980s, she found a woman living in poverty, surrounded by stray dogs, still refusing interviews. When the reporter asked if she remembered what happened, Lena stared into the distance and said, almost gently, "Remembering doesn't help. It only feeds ghosts." Her voice was calm, her eyes distant. And in that moment, the reporter understood. Lena didn't want justice or fame. She wanted peace. But peace is the one thing the world never gave her. History has a way of choosing what to remember. It keeps the numbers, the dates, the photographs, but it forgets the breathing, bleeding truth that lived behind them. Lena Medina became a medical record, a trivia fact, a cautionary tale whispered in classrooms. Yet, in all those retellings, she was never allowed to simply be a child. In Peru's medical archives, her name exists only as case number 5-39. The official report describes her as physically mature beyond her years, a clinical phrase used to disguise horror as science. There are no words about the fear that must have filled her tiny body. No mention of her mother's tears when doctors confirmed the unthinkable. No acknowledgement that somewhere, a predator walked free. As the 20th century marched on, Lena's story drifted between myth and moral lesson. Some called her a miracle of biology. Others accused her of deceit, insisting the pregnancy was fabricated or exaggerated. But every theory seemed to serve a purpose, to keep people from asking who had broken her innocence, and why no one was ever held accountable. In time, Lena's silence became her defense. By refusing to relive her past, she denied the world its voyeurism. She turned her pain into a wall, built stone by stone from the ashes of disbelief. The press moved on. The doctors died. The files yellowed and curled. And Lena, the child mother, the medical mystery, became a ghost in plain sight. Even today, her story resurfaces only when curiosity demands spectacle. Yet, beneath every retelling lies a deeper question. What kind of society can document a 5-year-old's pregnancy, photograph her body, and still call itself civilized? The answer lies not in the medicine, but in the mirror. Lena Medina lived into her 80s, long enough to watch the world change and forget her in equal measure. She never spoke publicly about the father of her child. She never sought recognition or justice. And perhaps that silence, heavy and unbroken, is the loudest accusation of all. Because her story was never just about biology or medicine. It was about control, about who gets to define truth, and whose suffering gets erased in the name of propriety. Lena was not an anomaly. She was a symbol of every silenced voice the world refused to hear. In the decades that followed, new scandals emerged, new horrors surfaced, and the world kept moving. But her story lingered, a crack in the perfect facade of modern civilization. It reminded us that sometimes the darkest chapters aren't buried in the past. They're written in the silence that follows. When people today discover Lena's photograph, the small child standing beside doctors in white coats, they often react with disbelief. But that disbelief is the very proof of our failure. It is easier to deny than to face what humanity is capable of doing to its most innocent. So, we are left with one question. The same question that echoed through the Andes in 1939 and still lingers today. Was Lena Medina a miracle of nature, or the living evidence of something the world could never bear to name? And perhaps that's why her story endures, not as a medical mystery, but as a warning. Because in the end, the world's youngest mother did not need science to explain her. She needed compassion, and no one offered it. By the mid-1940s, Lena had become a quiet figure haunting her own legend. The world had taken everything from her, her privacy, her childhood, her sense of safety, and returned only silence. Reporters who once begged for interviews vanished as soon as new scandals stole the headlines. The doctors who had touched her life with curiosity and dissection moved on to other cases, leaving her name behind in cold, clinical journals. But for Lena, the wound never healed. It simply learned how to hide. In the dusty streets of Tecrapo, where she returned after years under medical observation, people no longer looked at her as a child. They looked at her as an omen. Farmers would cross themselves when she walked past. Mothers whispered her name to hush their children. To them, she was a reminder of the world's cruelty wrapped in a child's frame. But there was also something else, fear. Not fear of Lena, but fear of what her existence proved. That innocence could be shattered in broad daylight, and no one would ever pay the price. Her son, Gerardo, grew up believing she was his sister. That was the story her parents told him, a lie built to protect both of them from the unbearable truth. But children sense what adults hide. He must have seen the tension in Lena's eyes whenever he asked too many questions. He must have heard the half-whispered words that followed them in the marketplace. And he must have felt the distance, an invisible barrier between them, built not of shame, but of survival. The bond between them was fragile yet fierce. She poured into him every ounce of love she had left. If the world had taken her innocence, she would not let it take her compassion too. But fate, cruel as ever, was not finished with her yet. When Gerardo was 10 years old, tragedy struck again. A sudden illness swept through the region, claiming many children. Despite Lena's desperate care, Gerardo fell sick. The doctors who had once examined her like a curiosity were nowhere to be found. Medicine was scarce, prayers even scarcer. Within days, her only child, the boy born from a mystery no one dared name, was gone. That death broke something in her that even time could not repair. Those who saw her afterward said she spoke less, moved slower, and seemed to fade into herself. It was as if losing him erased the last thread tying her to the world of the living. After Gerardo's burial, Lena began to avoid people entirely. The villagers said she roamed the hills at dusk, whispering in that strange language she once spoke as a girl, a language no one ever identified, no one ever recorded, and no one ever understood. Some said it was grief speaking, others that it was madness. But there were whispers, dark, persistent whispers, that perhaps Lena was never meant for this world. That whatever force had chosen her as its vessel had finally reclaimed what it had given. In every story, her life became less human and more myth, like the mountain spirits of old Peru, neither alive nor dead, only waiting between worlds. By the time the 20th century turned its face toward modernity, Lena was a forgotten ghost. Yet in every archive, every photograph, her eyes still stared back with that same expression, neither anger nor fear, but something more profound. Resignation. A look that seemed to say, "You can record my body, but you will never understand my soul." Decades passed, and Peru changed. The world was at war, then at peace, then at war again. Empires rose and fell, but in the mountain village where Lena Medina had once lived, her story remained. It was told in whispers at night, passed from grandmother to child, shaped and reshaped until no one could tell where truth ended and fear began. Some said she had been blessed, others cursed. To the villagers, she was no longer Lena. She was a legend carved from guilt, a shadow that never aged. In Lima's hospitals and universities, her name lived on for different reasons. Medical students still studied her file as a marvel of human biology. Photographs of her, tiny, wide-eyed, confused, were shown in lectures as evidence of precocious development. The words sounded harmless, clinical, detached. Yet every time her image appeared on a screen, her pain was resurrected. What they called science, she had lived as horror. Even as the decades turned to dust, the fascination refused to die. Documentaries, tabloids, and journalists all wanted to rediscover the world's youngest mother. But none wanted to find the woman she had become. They wanted the mystery, not the truth. They wanted the record, not the voice. And Lena, who had once been a child dissected by flashbulbs and questions, refused to give them that satisfaction. Those who tried to find her later in life described her home as quiet, almost barren. Curtains always drawn. A single chair facing the window. And outside that window, the vast, indifferent world, the same world that had watched her suffering and called it a miracle. To the curious, her silence was puzzling. But to Lena, silence was survival. There's something deeply unsettling about how easily humanity turns pain into fascination. Lena's story became a global headline not because it demanded justice, but because it entertained horror from a safe distance. The newspapers never named her predator. They never demanded accountability. Instead, they marveled at her biology, her maturity, her strangeness. They made her a spectacle and called it curiosity. That is how society absolved itself. By turning tragedy into wonder, it turned guilt into distraction. And Lena became a mirror for our collective denial. The scientists who studied her wanted to believe they were chasing discovery, not cruelty. The readers wanted to believe they were learning history, not consuming trauma. But the truth beneath it all was simpler and uglier. No one wanted to accept that what happened to Lena was not an accident of nature, but a human crime that would never be punished. Her body was extraordinary, yes, but her suffering was ordinary in its cause. Violence against innocence, indifference against vulnerability. The oldest story the world refuses to learn from. Every century has its Lena Medina, a child forgotten by justice and remembered only by myth. And so, in the fading black and white photograph of a girl standing beside men in lab coats, there is not just one victim. There is all of us, staring at what we have done and pretending not to see. Lena's silence wasn't just hers. It became the silence of an entire world too afraid to admit its own reflection. In the late years of her life, Lena Medina lived quietly in the small town of Pisco, far from the world that had once consumed her name. Her hair had turned silver, her voice soft as dusk, and yet, those who met her spoke of an aura that clung to her, not of sorrow, but of quiet resistance. She had survived something that no child should endure, and though the world tried to define her, she had reclaimed her narrative through silence. Neighbors said she rarely spoke of the past. When journalists tracked her down in the 1970s, offering money for her story, she would simply close the door. Her refusal became its own kind of rebellion, an act of control against a lifetime where she'd had none. She knew what they wanted, the sensational, the shocking, the grotesque. But she would give them nothing. Not her words, not her pain, not her truth. Even in her old age, she remained deeply protective of her privacy. The photograph of her as a child, standing beside doctors who smiled at the camera, had traveled around the world countless times. But behind that photograph was a truth too complex for headlines or medical charts. Lena wasn't a medical mystery. She was a reminder of how quickly empathy can disappear when curiosity takes its place. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, she would sit by her window, watching children play outside. Her eyes would follow them, not with envy, but with a deep, knowing tenderness. No one ever saw her cry, but those who looked close enough could see the reflection of another life, another childhood, stolen long ago but still flickering faintly inside her. The world forgot her name, but not the image. And maybe that was the cruelest part. She had become eternal, but only as a question. Historians and medical scholars continued to debate her case, dissecting her biology while ignoring her humanity. Articles still appeared, half a century later, questioning the details, her age, the paternity, the medical procedure. Every few years, her story resurfaced online or in magazines, stripped of empathy, repackaged for a new generation of morbid curiosity. Each retelling dug up her pain again, as though time had never passed. But Lena herself remained unmoved. Those close to her described her as quiet but strong, fiercely independent, working as a secretary in a small clinic. Perhaps that was her irony, to spend her adult life surrounded by doctors, the very kind of men who had once used her as a case study. Some said she chose that path deliberately, a way to reclaim power from those who had taken it. Others thought it was coincidence. But maybe it was something more profound, an act of silent defiance. By the time the world realized she had lived an entire life, had worked, loved, lost, and grown old, it was too late to ask what she truly felt. Lena had built walls so high around her memories that even death could not tear them down. And yet, her story refused to die with her. Because in the end, Lena Medina wasn't remembered as a person. She was remembered as a symbol of the failure of compassion, of the limits of science, of how easily we confuse fascination with understanding. Her life was proof that the most haunting stories are not born from ghosts or monsters, but from ordinary people who chose to look away. There's a kind of silence that echoes louder than screams, the silence that comes when the world witnesses horror and does nothing. Lena's story belongs to that silence. For decades, people read her case, whispered her name, shared her photograph. And yet, no one ever asked the question that truly mattered. How did the world allow this to happen? The answer, perhaps, lies in our obsession with spectacle. Humanity has always been drawn to the strange, the abnormal, the unexplainable. It makes us feel superior, safe, distant. To call Lena a medical anomaly was easier than calling her what she truly was, a child betrayed by those meant to protect her. Science gave the world a convenient escape route, a sterile vocabulary that turned her trauma into a phenomenon. Precocious puberty, unusual case, words that stripped away her pain and replaced it with curiosity. But the truth has always been uglier than the myth. Someone hurt her, someone destroyed her childhood, and no one was ever punished. That is the real story, buried beneath the textbooks and the newspaper clippings. A child's suffering became an experiment. A tragedy was rebranded as discovery, and a society that should have protected her turned its back, content to call her an enigma instead of a victim. Every so often, a new generation rediscovers Lena's name. The same questions repeat. The same fascination returns. And yet, the answers never change, because the world has not. We still consume other people's pain for curiosity. We still turn victims into headlines, trauma into history, and call it knowledge. Lena's story is not ancient. It is eternal. Imagine for a moment that Lena's story had happened today. Imagine the cameras, the interviews, the endless cycle of speculation and debate. Would it be any different? Or would we still do what we've always done? Reduce her to content, a viral tragedy, something to watch and forget? That is the horror hidden within her tale. It isn't only what happened to her. It's what her story reveals about us. Her case forces us to confront a truth few can bear. Evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes it hides behind respectability, doctors, priests, neighbors, even family. Sometimes the real horror is not the crime, but the silence that follows it. In Lena's time, silence was survival. In ours, it has become habit. We scroll, we share, we move on, but the stories remain, quietly accusing us of our indifference. Lena Medina's name should have been spoken with reverence, with outrage, with a demand for justice. Instead, it was spoken with fascination. The scientists got their studies. The journalists got their headlines. The world got its mystery. And Lena? She got a lifetime of ghosts that no one else could see. When she finally passed away, there were no obituaries in major papers, no memorials, no justice served. Just an echo, a reminder of a child forced into motherhood, and a world that called it miraculous. The most haunting part of her story isn't that it happened once. It's that it could happen again, and we might still look away. The tragedy of Lena Medina doesn't end with her death. It lives on, quietly embedded in the foundation of our so-called civilization. Because Lena wasn't the first child destroyed by silence, and she won't be the last. History is built on the bones of those the world refused to protect. Every era has its victims hidden behind polished words, custom, science, necessity. Every generation finds a way to justify its cruelty. In the 19th century, it was workhouses filled with starving orphans. In the early 20th, asylums where women were locked away for grieving too loudly. And in 1939, it was a 5-year-old girl whose body became a medical experiment. The faces change, but the pattern remains. Humanity calls it progress, yet every step forward seems to leave another child behind. For the doctors who examined Lena, the mystery was biological, not moral. They wanted to understand how her body could carry life, not why her soul was broken. They never looked beyond their instruments. They never considered that their fascination might be another form of violence. That every question, every test, every flashbulb of a camera stripped her further of what little humanity she still possessed. Even now, the language of science remains untouched by guilt. Her case is still listed in textbooks as a medical rarity. But the truth behind those words is unbearable. A society that could not bear to look at its own cruelty chose to bury it beneath the mask of discovery. Lena Medina became both a warning and a prophecy, proof of how easily empathy can vanish when curiosity takes its place. If you walk through the small towns of Peru today, you might still hear her name whispered, sometimes as legend, sometimes as prayer. To the older generation, she is a ghost that never left. Children ask who she was, and their grandparents hesitate before answering. How do you explain a story like hers? How do you tell them that the world is capable of destroying a child, then calling her survival a miracle? There's a particular cruelty in the way her story has been preserved, not through justice or compassion, but through morbid fascination. Her image is displayed in medical journals, in museum archives, even on the internet, stripped of dignity, frozen in time. She never gave consent for that. She never had a choice. The same society that failed to protect her continues to use her as an example, a symbol, a curiosity. But somewhere, between the cold words of the doctors and the fading whispers of villagers, the real Lena still exists. Not the myth, not the case study, but the child who once looked up at the mountains and dreamed of something better. The child who loved her son with a tenderness the world didn't deserve. The child who, even after everything, refused to break completely. Maybe that's her final act of defiance. Not her silence, but her endurance. She lived. She grew old. She survived the world that tried to consume her. And in that survival lies the cruelest, most beautiful truth of all. The world may have taken her childhood, but it could never take her will to live. There is something unsettling about the way the world remembers Lina Medina. Not as a child, not even as a victim, but as an anomaly. A name attached to numbers and dates, a body reduced to a medical impossibility. The tragedy is not just what happened to her, it's how quickly the world learned to move on. Newspapers that once screamed her story in bold letters soon forgot her name, replacing her with new spectacles. And the silence that followed was not born of mercy, but convenience. Her father, once accused, was released without consequence. Her mother vanished from public record. The doctors who claimed to protect her went on to publish their findings in prestigious journals. The case became a professional triumph, a stain rebranded as a discovery. No one asked Lina what she felt. No one ever apologized. In the quiet corners of medicine and morality, her story was treated like a solved equation, when in truth, it was a confession of human failure. Perhaps that's what makes this story so terrifying. Not the crime itself, but the ease with which it was forgotten. The world's fascination with innocence only lasts as long as it can be contained. Once the spectacle fades, so does compassion. Lina was not buried under the weight of scandal. She was buried under the weight of indifference. And in that indifference lies the darkest truth of all. The world is far more comfortable with monsters than with mirrors. When historians and journalists tried to revisit her story decades later, they found nothing but locked doors and missing records. The hospital where she gave birth no longer kept her files. The doctors had died, their notes mysteriously lost or destroyed. Even her son's grave was unmarked. A boy who lived only 10 years, buried quietly, as though his existence was an inconvenience. Every piece of evidence that could have given her truth was erased by time or intention. And yet, her name endures, whispered in classrooms, written in articles, spoken in disbelief. Lina Medina, a child who bore a child. A mystery no one dared to solve. But maybe the truth was never about biology or science. Maybe it was about guilt, collective, generational guilt, the kind that hides beneath progress and respectability. Because to acknowledge her story fully would mean admitting that civilization failed its most basic duty, to protect a child. When we look at her photograph, the small face staring at the camera, neither smiling nor crying, we are forced to confront something primitive within ourselves. The image is not just of a girl, but of everything we try to forget. Our history, our silence, our complicity. Lina did not need to speak for her story to haunt the world. Her silence became the echo of every child forgotten by time, every victim erased by progress. And in that silence, the world still trembles. Lina Medina grew into adulthood under the same shadow that had stolen her childhood. She never sought fame, never accepted interviews, and never allowed herself to become the symbol others wanted her to be. She lived quietly, working as a secretary in a clinic, a cruel irony, perhaps, to spend her life surrounded by the same profession that once turned her tragedy into spectacle. Those who met her in later years said she was kind but distant, polite but unreachable, as if she had built invisible walls around her soul. And maybe she had to, because for Lina, survival meant erasing the past without forgetting it. It meant learning to live beside her own ghost, the 5-year-old child she once was, the one who carried a weight too monstrous to name. The questions never stopped, not in whispers, not in print, not in the eyes of strangers. Yet Lina never answered them. She never revealed who the father was, never explained the impossible. Her silence became her weapon, a rebellion against a world that had already taken everything. In that silence, Lina reclaimed what little power she could. She denied the public the closure it craved. She denied the institutions the satisfaction of turning her into a case study once more. In the end, her refusal to speak was not fear, it was defiance. It was her way of saying, "You do not get to write the ending of my story." Today, more than 80 years later, Lina Medina's name still drifts through history like a ghost no one knows how to face. She never spoke to the press again. She never profited from her story. She never sought pity. In a world that thrives on exposure, her silence became the loudest scream. For some, she is a medical marvel. For others, she is a symbol of human cruelty. But for those who listen closely, her story is not about science or scandal. It is about the unbearable cost of survival. The mystery remains. How could this happen? Who failed her? How did a civilization so proud of its progress allow a 5-year-old girl to carry a child? These questions are not meant to be answered. They are meant to haunt. Because the truth of Lina Medina is not in what we know, but in what we ignored. So when we speak her name, we are not just recalling a medical record. We are standing before the mirror of humanity itself, a reflection of the secrets we bury, the innocence we betray, and the stories we choose to forget. Lina's life is a reminder that history is not made by the powerful, but by those who were never given a choice. She did not ask to be remembered, but she was. And in that memory, the world is judged. Long after Lina Medina faded from public memory, the world continued to chase explanations. Medical journals, documentaries, conspiracy forums, all asking the same impossible question. How could this be real? Scientists debated precocious puberty. Theologians called it divine punishment or proof of evil. And journalists fought to expose the truth. But none of them ever found it. Because what they sought was not medical clarity. It was moral absolution. They wanted to believe there was an answer that would make them feel better, that would make the horror make sense. But the truth of Lina's life could never fit into any theory. It existed beyond reason, in that quiet, unbearable place where reality itself seems to fracture. Even now, photographs of the young girl surface online, often without context, shared like relics of a mystery rather than the image of a broken childhood. People look at her face and ask questions science can't touch. Was she aware of what happened to her? Did she ever forgive the world that watched? The tragedy is not only that she was a child mother, it's that the world turned her pain into a curiosity. In that process, her humanity was dissected, replaced by fascination. And so, in every retelling, Lina becomes less a person and more a mirror, reflecting how easily empathy dies when faced with the grotesque. And yet, in the silence of her later years, Lina Medina did something extraordinary. She lived, quietly, privately, defiantly. She refused to let her name be a monument to tragedy. While the world speculated, she built a life that was ordinary. Perhaps that was her greatest act of rebellion. To survive, to grow older, to walk through markets, to hold her own child's hand, to exist without permission. She never needed the world to understand her. She only needed it to leave her in peace. History, however, is not kind to peace. It prefers the sensational, the monstrous, the unexplainable. But Lina's story reminds us that true horror does not live in ghosts or curses. It lives in human eyes that refuse to see, in systems that fail to protect, in silence that swallows the truth. And as time erases the names of the people who surrounded her, the doctors, the reporters, the doubters, her name remains. Not as a medical anomaly, but as a warning. The world's youngest mother never spoke her story aloud. And maybe she didn't have to. Because in her silence, she forced the world to confront the very thing it fears most, its own reflection. Every society builds its myths around innocence, the idea that childhood is sacred, untouchable, protected by the invisible walls of morality. Lina Medina's story shattered that illusion. Her case didn't just challenge medicine. It exposed the hypocrisy of a world that claims to value purity, yet looks away when it is defiled. In 1939, while newspapers treated her pregnancy as a scientific marvel, few asked the real question: who allowed this to happen? Who failed to see her pain before the doctors did? Behind the sterile white walls of hospitals and the polished language of research papers, there was a crime, not of biology, but of neglect. The silence that surrounded her became its own kind of violence. Officials buried records, reporters sensationalized her tragedy, and her community withdrew in shame. To them, Lina was both a miracle and a curse, a living contradiction they couldn't bear to understand. Even the church, which sent priests to investigate, found no devil to blame, no scripture to soothe. They left as confused as the doctors, whispering that perhaps some mysteries weren't meant for human comprehension. But for Lena, there was no mystery, only the endless, unanswered question of why no one protected her. Over the decades, psychologists, theologians, and historians have tried to reclaim her story, to frame it through their lenses: morality, medicine, philosophy. But every interpretation fails for one simple reason. Lena Medina was not a symbol. She was a child, a human being who experienced something no child ever should. The deeper researchers dig into her past, the more hollow their findings become, because the truth they seek is emotional, not scientific. The horror of her story isn't found in what happened to her. It's in how the world responded. In a time when people worshipped progress and science, Lena's case was treated as an anomaly to be studied, not a tragedy to be mourned. That reaction tells us more about civilization than about Lena herself. It reveals a truth darker than any ghost story, that horror is not confined to haunted houses or graveyards. It's found in institutions, in power, in human indifference. Lena Medina's life is the mirror history avoids, because it forces us to see the cruelty that hides behind civility. And perhaps that's why her story still lingers, because somewhere deep inside, we know it could happen again. What remains of Lena Medina's story today is not her face in faded photographs, nor the cold ink of medical records stored in Lima's archives. It is the silence that follows when her name is spoken. That silence is heavier than any statistic, more haunting than any legend. It reminds us that history is not just made of wars and inventions. It is built upon the broken lives we choose not to remember. Lena's childhood was stolen, dissected, and then quietly erased. Yet her name refuses to disappear. It drifts like a shadow between compassion and curiosity, a reminder that some truths are too brutal to fit neatly into history books. Doctors who once analyzed her case are now gone. The hospital walls that witnessed her agony have been rebuilt, repainted, renamed. But beneath those new foundations lies the same question, not how, but why. Why does humanity search for monsters and myths, while ignoring the monsters within itself? In every retelling of Lena's tragedy, that question grows louder. The real horror wasn't in what happened to her body, but in what the world allowed to happen to her soul. If Lena could speak to the world today, perhaps she would not tell her story at all. Perhaps she would tell us to look closer at the stories happening now, the unseen, the unheard, the silenced. Because her life was not a phenomenon, it was a warning. A warning about how easily innocence can be consumed by the machinery of disbelief, shame, and denial. Her survival was both miracle and indictment, proof that the human spirit can endure what it should never have to, and a condemnation of the world that made endurance necessary. So when you hear her name, do not look for explanations. Look for accountability. Look for the places where history tried to forget her. And in that forgetting, remember what she became, a symbol not of wonder, but of warning. The youngest mother in history, the child the world could not protect. Lena Medina's life asks one question we can never escape. When the innocent suffer and the world watches in silence, who is truly to blame?